I call Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the debate on the government's financial statements. Now, the National Party told us to judge their economic performance on whether they achieved a surplus or deficit, repeatedly, over and over the last 6 years. This is something we've been told. And as they approach a record equaling 7 deficits in a row, of course, the previous record was set by the Holyoake government, 7 budget deficits in a row. So as they approach that record, we can only say to the government, on your own terms, you failed to meet what you said was your objective, which was to actually produce a budget surplus. Now, surely what that says to you is it's time to reconsider the big tax cuts that the government gave to the wealthiest people in the country that drove the budget further into deficit. Now, it's worth remembering that prior to this government, we had Michael Cullen in 9 budget surpluses in a row. Now, each time one of those surpluses came around, the National Party said to us, we shouldn't pay down debt, we should give the surpluses away in the form of tax cuts to the wealthy. And at the time, the Labor Party, the Labor-led government, with the support of the Greens and others, said no, we should use the surpluses to pay down debt. And fortunately, that's exactly what Cullen did, paid down debt, so that when this government came in and faced a series of genuine challenges, the global financial crisis, the earthquakes, there was a lot of lee room in order to borrow, which this government has done over and over and over. But unfortunately, part of the borrowing is to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy. And I would say to the Finance Minister, surely even you, looking back at that, must recognise that was a mistake. Now, but the thing is that budget deficits are not really the best measure for whether a government is performing well. I mean, the National Party has told us we should judge them by budget deficits, but the truth is that actually it's one measure and it's an important measure, but actually there's a lot of other indicators we should look at. For example, we should look at the current account deficit. So the current account deficit is currently rising. It's $7.8 billion in the year to December 2014. Perhaps we should look at the growing net international investment liability, which has now gone up to $154 billion. Now, it's certainly true that there were some reductions in both of those numbers around the GFC, but what we're seeing again is that the New Zealand economy is running big deficits. And the truth is that New Zealand cannot borrow our way to prosperity. That is something that the Finance Minister himself acknowledged when he first took the role, but as he's been unable to crack that problem, and it's coming back once again, it's only going to get worse according to the Reserve Bank projections, this is a problem which is going to be passed on to the next government to try to deal with. We simply cannot borrow our way to prosperity. Linked to that is the research and development deficit. New Zealand has one of the lowest levels of investment in research and development in the OECD, and this government is unfortunately cutting investment into research and development, the funding to businesses that want to invest in R&D. Even the most recent announcement that the government made, which was a small nominal increase, when you look at it in real terms, it is a decrease in R&D investment once you take into account inflation over the next years ahead, looking at the government's draft investment plan for science. There are, in fact, great businesses in New Zealand that want to invest in research and development, that want to embrace the opportunities of smart green economics. But it's very difficult when you have a government which subsidises the primary sector, commodities, subsidises milk production, it subsidises oil exploration, but it strangles high-tech industries, it strangles smart green innovation, because in every other country, those industries get a lot of support on research and development from their government, because that's an essential part of the package. But under this government, we have very low levels of investment in R&D. Well, what about the housing deficit? It's simply a fact now that for many Aucklanders, their houses earn more in a year than they do. The median house price has gone up by over $250,000 in Auckland since this government came into office. That is terrible economics and it's terrible social policy at the same time. The Reserve Bank is really worried about the Auckland housing bubble and has called for a capital gains tax on investment properties, as have the Greens, to dampen the housing bubble. The National Party unfortunately opposes that measure to close that loophole, and Labor, well, I'm not quite sure what Labor's position is currently on capital gains tax. We also know that offshore demand for housing is virtually unlimited, and so we need some constraints on offshore demand for housing in Auckland, as many other countries have, but so far we don't have that. We also know that in terms of the supply side, increasing high-quality housing density around improved public transport routes is actually the only solution on supply side that works. Auckland needs to go up, not out. That's just a basic reality. Mr. Chair.
Dr. Russell Norman.
But this government, unfortunately, has been backing sprawl and it's been backing motorways rather than compact urban form and rail. So it's going in exactly the wrong direction in terms of dealing with the housing affordability and livability crisis that Aucklanders are facing. So instead of supporting compact urban form, rail, which we know is the way to actually reduce house prices in Auckland in terms of the supply side, the government is backing sprawl, which makes Auckland more and more unlivable. And what about the climate deficit? The government, when it first came in, gutted the emissions trading scheme. It subsidised road transport and hence fossil fuel use in roads. It subsidises dairy expansion and it subsidises oil exploration. And so, unsurprisingly, New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions are surging. Now, the Minister for Climate Change, and I use the term advisedly, the Minister for Climate Change has tried to hide the massive net deforestation that's underway right now in New Zealand. He put out a press release saying that afforestation was ahead of deforestation in New Zealand, except that it isn't. And so Mr Grosser had to issue a new press release, a correction to his press release, where he had to acknowledge that, in fact, deforestation is happening at about twice the rate, twice the number of hectares, than afforestation currently in New Zealand, according to the government's own figures that they released a couple of weeks ago. And of course, the impact of that is that New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, and our intensity, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, net greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP, continues to increase. So we're going in exactly the wrong direction in terms of climate change. And the cost to the taxpayer is enormous. Treasury are trying to estimate what is the cost to the taxpayer of this big surge in New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions. They estimate it will probably be about up to $52 billion in order to buy carbon credits to meet our climate change targets. So the taxpayer, the Crown, will have to buy carbon credits, an enormous quantity of carbon credits on the international market, to try to meet our international commitments to reduce or marginally reduce our net greenhouse gas emissions. Now that, of course, isn't free. The taxpayer has to pay for that. And depending on the price for carbon credits internationally, that will mean that the taxpayer has to pay up to $52 billion in order to buy those carbon credits internationally, according to the New Zealand Treasury. I think this really demonstrates the way that this government is passing these deficits on to future generations and future governments. So they introduced a whole series of policies that resulted in a big increase in net greenhouse gas emissions, the climate deficit, if you like, and the impact of that on future governments is they're going to have to buy carbon credits internationally to try to meet our targets, and there'll be a huge fiscal burden on the taxpayer as a result of that. We still, of course, have no official emission reduction targets to present to the Paris conference coming up at the end of the year. I think the tragedy really in all of this from the point of view of New Zealand Inc. as a whole is that it is really an enormous missed opportunity. New Zealand already has a great reputation, 100% pure and so forth. It is a great opportunity for New Zealand to grab the opportunity of smart green innovation, which is just taking off internationally. But unfortunately, New Zealand is locked into a 1950s mentality, or the current government is, unfortunately. There's a lot of New Zealand businesses who are trying to break out of that, but the government's locked into the mentality that says this climate change stuff doesn't really matter and, you know, all that innovation stuff. We're going to do milk powder and we're going to do oil. But that really is locking us into a very unproductive kind of future and is missing one of the great economic opportunities of the 21st century, which is sustainability. Purpose-driven capitalism, if you like, capitalism of abundance and sustainability is going to be the marker of this century. And New Zealand is completely missing out on this opportunity because we have a government that cannot see it, that looks backwards as it travels into the future. Finally, there is the biodiversity deficit. New Zealand is in the middle of a great biodiversity crisis, and really we're losing magical things that are hard to put a number on. This debate's about the financial statements of the government, but as we lose the amazing biodiversity that we inherited from those that came before us, It's hard to put a number on the enormous loss that our children won't be able to see the amazing plants and animals that once lived in this amazing country, these islands, this kingdom of the birds. And as we lose biodiversity because we really, as a government and as a country, haven't put the effort and the financing we need into the Department of Conservation and elsewhere to protect that biodiversity, we're losing something that can't really be put numbers on. And I think that's perhaps one of the irreparable damages that governments can leave.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Bill English.